and it's on the topic of semiotics and nature. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Um, okay. So basically, a lot of this shiur is kind of primarily lifted from Golden Doves and Silver Dots by Chacham Yosef Faur. But I hope that through this shiur we can kind of learn a little bit about semiotics and semantics, and then also um, appreciate a little bit more kind of interesting Hebrew linguistic or etymology. Okay, so starting off kind of a, a bit high level. Rachel, do you want to mute, like, I don't know, whatever that loud noise is? Okay, and also share the Word document. Can you make that the main screen?
If we as users just click on Rachmiel's name, it'll come up as the main screen. Right now, it's the main screen
Awesome.
for me.
Okay, perfect. Cool. Thank you. Okay,
Can I
so
ask the Hebrew letters at the top? My Hebrew's not the best, but that
no
looks like
idea.
gibberish.
No idea. I think Rachel added it. I think it's supposed to say. Oh, it says. I think it says semiotics and nature.
I
Maybe.
didn't add. I didn't add the here. I don't know what it is.
Okay.
Whatever.
No worries. Yeah, it's gibberish. Ignore it. Okay.
Okay, just making
So,
sure.
the basic idea is, kind of living in the 21st century, we're constantly faced with this question of, is there or is there not a God? And, a lot of the times the answers to, or the reasons for, like, there isn't a God is we're able to explain everything, with these laws of nature, laws of physics, and they can inherently, kind of prove everything, and show how everything works, and you don't need God. Um, and I'm not here to kind of, like truly answer that question, but rather just offer, kind of maybe like the Hebrew perspective on that question. And the first thing is, kind of when I was at least in, I guess, grade school, I remember like a teacher one time kind of brought up this concept, and like the clever answer, air quotes there, for those who are just listening, the clever answer there was that the gematria of Ha Elohim with a He Hayedi'ah and Teva have the same gematria, and therefore, or Elohim and Ha Teva with He Hayedi'ah have the same gematria, and that was to show that nature and God are equal. That was like the best answer we got was kind of silly gematria. Um, and so, hopefully maybe through this you can kind of find a better answer. Um,
Wait, but so this was an atheist teacher, or what?
no, this was like, it was just like, I don't know if it was like truly the best answer, but rather this was his like, we were in probably like 7th grade or 6th grade at the time, so that was like the cute, clever answer to something like that.
It's funny because it reminds me of Chacham David Nieto when he said that there's no word for
Yeah,
nature.
I, I get I,
And
I get exactly to that.
right, right.
But yes, exactly, exactly. So that's definitely like an important feature to kind of the second half of this shiur. Um, and that, by the way, is from Golden Doves Rachmael, or at least it's highlighted there. Okay, so um, we even see this quote here by Yeshayahu Leibowitz. Even like among the Jewish scholars, you kind of see like this internal battle, right? You see this point that he makes. He says, God did not reveal Himself in history or in nature. Were things otherwise, then nature and history would be godly, and thus would be perfect and worthy of worship themselves. There would be no room for the holy God who transcends natural reality, since then reality itself is divine and man himself is God, right? So he says basically that God did not reveal Himself through nature, because if so, then nature itself would be godly and would be worthy of worship, right? In other words, nature could be something kind of, almost independent of God that would be worthy of worship. And this is kind of like the natural conclusion he makes from his first sentence. And obviously, that's not like a Jewish perspective, right? We don't worship trees. We don't worship the rain. Rather, right? We view it, as from God.
Right. Well, his idea was that anytime God acted, it would detract from his oneness, because an action is like an extension of something that should be completely one and have no need for action.
Okay. Okay, fine. I think still I can still criticize that point, and you'll see it kind of later on. I think when we get into semiotics in just a second, you'll kind of start to see that. But even kind of early on, kind of in the next phase, there was this idea, it became really popular during the Enlightenment, called this clockwork universe. So this is kind of the rejection of God and promotion of nature, essentially. Right, Isaac Newton derives his laws of motion, and physics kind of reaches its really kind of pinnacle point, to the extent where people start rejecting God and follow physics, and essentially make this argument that the universe is just a clock, or analogous to a clock, where all the rules were set in place in the beginning, and then God essentially is now removed from the universe, and the universe functions on its own course. Right, and so you don't need God anymore. You just need all these rules of physics and nature, and you're kind of good to go. Okay.
In other words, deism is more precisely that God created the world. Like the most religious deist will tell you that God wants you to keep on doing whatever in the world, but He's not going to be involved. He wants humans to deal with it. And so deism is closely related to humanism and things like that. But it's actually not a contradiction. And I think it's more Maimonidean to say at this point, it's not a contradiction to have God's hashgacha, His providence in the world, and still require essentially a humanistic idea that the point is that you're supposed to do what's right and not to rely on God's intervention.
Yep, exactly. And so that's kind of like the intro, kind of views of nature versus God, that I kind of want to just get across. The next section, and before I get to this, it's going to be kind of a brief intro into kind of this idea of what is speech. But one thing that I want people to remember is, kind of like the views that you have, it's not necessarily kind of right or wrong per se, but rather kind of what is your perspective, right? Someone can look at a ball with a design on it, let's say like a red ball, right? And one person can look at it and describe the shape, and another person can look at it and describe the color. And they're both describing the ball, right? Neither one of them is wrong when they say that object is circular, and the other person says that object is red, but rather they're just having two different perspectives on kind of what they're seeing. And so there's just something to keep in mind. Kind of go back to it in a bit. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this idea of creation is the speech of God. And we have here kind of a lot of different quotes from Tanakh. Right, the first one is from the first chapter of Bereshith. Vayomer Elohim yehi or, vahi or. And there's a comment. Hamfaor cites it. I don't remember who he's quoting, but the idea of like the ta'amim here is that wahi or is essentially almost immediately on its own in a direct sof pasuk, right? There's no like marich tarha or anything to it. And the idea is that it's almost like an immediate outcome, almost to the extent that like God's speech is actually, is the light. Yirmiyahu says, "Halocho devari ka'esh neum Adonai uchfati shefoses sala." So he says again, like, right, God's words are actually like are the creation. They're the acts of creation and coming out in many different ways. Tilim bidvara Adonai shamayim na'asu v'ruachpi na'asu v'ruachpi v'kol seva'am, and then devarim ya'aruf kematar likhi tizal katpal imrati. Right. So all of these things are showing that creation is actually the speech of God. It's not like, sometimes you'll see, okay, God like asa or something like that, but in a lot of these cases here, you're seeing it's the dibur, right? The beracha that we say all the time, asher bidvaro ma'ariv aravim, or in Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam, shehakol nihya bidbaro. Right, all of these things are kind of showing that speech is an essence of creation. And so you can actually start to view almost the world as God's speech and start to analyze the world through the idea of speech. Give me 1 second. Okay. The next quote is from Rabbi Yehuda Levy in Sefer HaKuzarei, and he even is very explicit about it. He says, "ברגע שניסב עליו דיבור זה, כך ברגע שנאמר יהי אור, יהי רקיע יסע עם המאמר המעשה." Right, so he says that point that I actually just mentioned, which was the minute God said something, like it happened, and it was almost as if the ma'aseh and the ma'amar were completely interconnected. And he even says, "Ma'aseh ze hu hasefer shema more ala kethav, ki kethav ha'eloah hem bero'av, v'dibur ha'eloah hu ketavo sfirato hi devaro." Right? So he's basically saying that the Maaseh is almost like a book, and God is writing in the book, and that's His creation. So again, right, like it's almost treating. I would say that speech and writing are very related here, because the idea is that they're both trying to convey information to a second party. But he's saying here that the world is God's book, and that the creatures are the writing. And even Perush HaRalbag, when Moshe is talking to God, he says, "Va'ata im tisa hattatham mim'ayin mehanina misifrecha asher kathavta." So Ralbag comments on, he says, "Ina sefer shekatav Hashem hu hamesiuth bichlalo." Right? In other words, the sefer that Moshe is talking about is actual reality. That's a sefer. That's a book. ويمشي مסיעות לספר ככמו שהספר יורה על הסיור אשר ממנו היה מסיעותו, כן הנמסך המוחש מורה על נימוס העולם המושכל אשר הוא אצל השם שממנו היה מסיעות הנמסך המוחש. So again, right, like really, like the mesiut is the sefer, like reality, like this world that we have is analogous to God's book. Okay, and so as we've seen this in several different places now, you can essentially 1 second. Come in, laser.
I'll just have a bug, but
Are you going to dial in?
his point over here. He sees the world.
Try this one.
It's like the Torah is the ultimate guide on how one should behave in the world. And therefore, when he says to powerful book, he's not saying that it means just the world. He means that when it says Torah, it also means the world, because that's Ralbag's view, is that the world and the Torah is the ultimate guide for the world, and you don't need any other guide but Torah. That you can get everything from Torah, essentially. So it's like for him, Torah and the world are one and the same. Which is that's his view.
Yeah. Raphael, are you able to help Laser? It said the link isn't working for him. I don't know. No, did you hear me?
Yeah, I'll send him I'll send him again.
Okay. Okay, so basically the whole point here is that, right, you can view the world as a book or as God's speech. And so I think if we analyze kind of some particular elements of speech, we can start to then understand the world better through that lens. Because this is where I want to get into kind of this whole idea of semiotics and semantics, and this idea of signifier and a signified. So the idea of semiotics in a high level is that it is a sign, and it has a precise value in isolation, no ambiguity, parts of a whole, right? So the idea of a stop sign, right? A stop sign means stop, and there's no ambiguity. There's nothing unclear about it, right? Like in either it's going to have meaning or it's not going to have meaning. The idea of semantics, though, is that there is this ambiguity, right? Like if I say a sentence, right, it has the possibility of being unclear to someone else, um, and you have to kind of process the whole sentence at once in order to even have a chance to understand it. And I think kind of the main difference between this idea of semantics and semiotics is that semantics will have multiple options, but semiotics will not, right? There's a one-to-one in semiotics, but there's a one-to-many in semantics. And I think even just generally, right, like if I'm speaking or if I'm writing a book, right, the information has to be conveyed. But if I say a sentence, the way I understand that sentence and the way you or someone else hears that sentence might not be the same, right? I could tell you X, Y, Z, and you might actually walk away thinking ABC and not X, Y, Z. And as a result, right, there is this ambiguity and there is this kind of like, I would say, active. There's active participation on the listener's end, and the same way in a book, right? An author can write something in a book, but the reader who's reading it is also active because what they're going to take away is kind of the information that they understand. And so, as such, there are these two sides, right? There's the first piece, which is what I say, and then there's the second piece, which is what the listener hears, and they're not one-to-one. And this is kind of like the first part. What I say is essentially the golden dove, and then the way it gets filtered into out there into the world is the silver dots, which is what everyone takes away. And I think the other point to maybe like highlight is the silver dots are the reason that there's an active point to the listener or to the reader is because it's going to get filtered through their preconceived notion of of reality or books, right? Like I can speak about something and someone else might have other thoughts that kind of relate to it. They'll understand what I'm saying almost influenced or filtered through those prior thoughts. So there's they're not going to be, they're essentially, it's impossible to be unbiased. There's going to be that element on that end. And I think, do you want to scroll down, Rachmael, a little bit? Actually, never mind. I'll just talk about this for a bit more. I think there are lots of different ways that you can see this, especially in Tanakh or Halakha even, right? So this idea that everything, right, does have a meaning that is understood by someone else, but it's going to be different by them. So one of the points that they make in actually the Ten Commandments, right, because it's actually quite apropos because we're going to be reading it this Shabbat, right? So the Torah there comments, it says, "V'chol ha'am ro'im et ha'koloth," right? The nation is seeing the voices, and so obviously, right, like, how is that possible? Voices are heard, not seen. So one of the comments that they make is that the level of nebu'ah that they had was to the extent that there wasn't the level of filtering or processing that they had on their end was very minimal. In other words, right, God said, live in a sukkah, and Bnei Israel essentially immediately like knew what a sukkah was, and it was kind of like one-to-one. It wasn't like they had these preconceived notions necessarily that were impacting how they understood it. Not only that, right, Harambam in his Hakdamat, the Mishnah Torah, comments, right, he says, Kula misvot shnitnu l'Moshe b'Sinai beferushan nitanu, right? The mitzvot were given already with their perush, right? A perush is very similar to, what the other person understands, right? Because it's almost like an explanation or a translation in some way, and so it's getting filtered by the other person. But the idea is that there is no, it's impossible to give a mitzvah without the perush, because if not, how could it even be understood by the person receiving it? Granted, though, right, that perush can change over time, and that's the whole idea of like dinim mufla'im, right? But the idea is that the way that they take shape can differ, but they do have to have a shape that is molded by the second party, not by the first party. And it's to the extent that almost that what I say doesn't matter. What matters more is what the other person hears. Right? Like I can write a book and I can have this intent for the book to mean X, Y, Z, but if everyone who reads it understands it to be different, then what I actually intended almost doesn't impact reality. And that's almost kind of like similar to the Matrix, right? Like the whole a big part of the movie, right, is your perception, and perception equaling reality. And if everyone thinks that what they're seeing is real, then how much does it matter that it isn't really real, or what does it mean to be really truly real? And even I think that point is also related to, right, in Pirkei Avot it says that someone has to be koneh olamo, right? They have to be able to like essentially acquire their own world. And I think that's also very similar. It's the idea of them kind of being able to recognize their perception of reality, and to recognize that the way they see the world isn't how other people necessarily see the world, but to be able to almost transcend that, to understand, yes, the way I see the world is going to be filtered by my experiences, my environment, my preconceived notions, but that isn't the only way to view the world. Any kind of points, comments, questions about this whole idea of like semiotics, semantics, perception, perception being reality?
Yeah, I'll just mention about because you didn't really discuss very much when you discussed the Korzybski's dictum, the map is not the territory.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all these types of things. Now, for people who don't understand general semantics, well, the idea is that the map not being the territory is that you can have a map which perfectly fits a territory drawing and represents a territory, or you can have a map that is a made-up territory, or you have a map which partially represents a territory, in that you have a symbol is not a signal. A signal is what, except for semiotics, it is what it is. Stop means stop, go means go, and but a symbol doesn't necessarily mean exactly that. Like for example, and there's a book, and I highly recommend it. It's like the #1 book to read on general semantics. It's the first book you should read. I'll just see. I'll make it show it on the screen. This one, Language and Thought and Action by Hayakawa, and it is fantastic, and it's a bestseller for a very good reason. But basically, so it's the best. It is the best introduction to the topic, and he discusses general semantics, and he discusses a lot of these points. Like for example, and I think this is an important point to make, is like how humans have a certain ability to see things like animals don't. Like for example, he says that when a human comes to a stoplight and it says go, so the human will process that as a symbol, right? So that he'll first check if there's any cars coming, and then it'll go. He won't just go as soon as it sees green. Whereas if you trained a monkey to drive, as soon as it sees green, it's going to go, no matter what the consequences are. So I think that ties into the point that even though people, perceive things one way, well, as soon as you're perceiving it not as a signal but as a symbol, so then of course there's always going to be some level of subjectivity, which I think was the point being made, that people are going to process it differently. So anyway, so I highly recommend the book. It is the best introduction into the topic.
Yeah, actually, good point. One other point that I forgot to mention is, again, to your point of like the symbol just being a symbol, and just that is the idea of like, you do have a signifier, which is the word that we use for it, or the picture, the image, or something like that, and then the signified, which is the underlying thing it's trying to represent, right? Essentially, right, the true thing you're trying to describe. But the point is that the signifier doesn't have to be related in any way to the signified, right? Like Shakespeare's "A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet," right? If you call a rose, or if you actually called it a violet, the rose would still be red and have thorns. It wouldn't actually affect the inherent qualities of said object. And that's kind of another really important point to make, is that, like the name will relate. In other words, right, you're going to call it a rose because it, rose means something in your language, and that thing has those qualities. But if you had called it something else, it wouldn't affect the qualities of that object. And so, with that, I'd like to kind of analyze the word teva from an etymological perspective. Rahmal, can I take a quick break to grab something to drink?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, BRB. BRB.
All right.
Yeah, so I wanted to say, that understanding of language Harambam had, but not everybody who says that Hebrew is somehow inherent in the nature of the world, or whatever they say.
I think that now the whole point of with the general semantics is that language it's a human thing, obviously. I think the difference between, for example, Ramban and Rambam is that for Rambam, the only reason why Lashon Kodesh is Lashon Kodesh is because it doesn't have any rude words in it, because it's it's the language that the Torah uses, but there's no inherent objective value to it. I guess it's all subjective. It's language. That's what language is. Anyway.
Yeah.
Aaron's back.
Exactly. Okay, so Rachmel kind of alluded to this point earlier. The word teva is not it's not a biblical word or even a rabbinic Hebrew word. The first time the word teva was used is in the Middle Ages. Right, so that means there was almost like a conscious choice.
You mean the first time it was used to refer to nature?
Yeah, to refer to nature. So that means that there was almost a conscious choice to use this word, and I think by analyzing this word with everything that we just learned about semiotics and semantics in mind, we can gain a much deeper appreciation for why this word was used. So obviously the first thing we look at for when we're trying to understand a word is in Hebrew is what is the shoresh, right? So for teva, it's going to be tet, bet, ayin, and other similar. And then we kind of think of what are other words that have that shoresh. So I would kind of divide them into the three groups. So toveya means to drown. Coin is matbeya, and coin and tabaat, like a signet or like a ring. I'm going to say that they're related for the time being, and then nature, teva, all have this trilateral root. Okay, so first I'll quickly just the connection between to drown and a coin. I think is if you kind of think about a coin matbeya as also a tabaat, right? Like the seal or the stamp that someone has to do, right? So initially, when someone first kind of creates a stamp, they first have to immerse the stamp into the ink, and then put the seal or their stamp. And so when they're immersing it in the ink, they're almost as if it's drowning in the ink. And so that's the immediate connection between the first two, between toveya and coin, matbeya. Now for the next one, for teva, the connection there is what I'm about to kind of elaborate. So the first things is, let's kind of understand, what is the significance of matbeya, coin or tabat, in Jewish thought. So we have in Masechet Avodah Zarah, this is actually in like the first or second daf. It's talking about when all the nations will kind of come before God to demand the Torah or something like that. They're talking about which is going to be the first nation who's going to appear before God. And so their answer is Miyad nikhnasa lefanaw malchut Romi tehila. So the first nation that's going to approach is the kingdom of Rome. And so they say, why? Maita ama says Mishum de Hashiva Milan de Hashiva Dichtib Wadachal Khula Deshinavat. Okay. They say, why would Romi go first? And it says, Amar Rabbi Yohanan Zo Romi Hayevet Shetave'a Yasa Bechol Ha'olam. It says Rome goes first because its currency was accepted everywhere, right? Their coins were essentially like a global currency. Okay, so kind of there's already this almost power associated with coins and this relation to a kingdom.
Well, I just read Hamzaul. He writes in the Horizontal Society the reason why the Chachamim never considered Paras to be a real empire, and is because its coin didn't go out. Is that the coin created the empire?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And you'll see even Mishneh Torah says in Hilchot Gezela says Bamed Davarim Amurim B'Melech Shematbe'o Yoseb Othan Ha'arasot. He's talking about when is a king allowed to tax a certain sub-nation that he's ruling over in order to get to be able to like build bridges and things like that, right? When is he allowed to take money from them in order to fund the national infrastructure? So he says that's okay, that's not gezel, when the king's currency is accepted. Right? Because they've essentially agreed by accepting his currency, they've accepted his dominion over them, and then they will be subservient to him. But then he says, Aval matbe'o yoseh הרי כגזלן בעל זרוע וכמו חבורת ליסטים המזוינים שאין דיניהן דין וכן מלך זה בכל עבדיו כגזלן לכל דבר. Right, if a king doesn't have his currency accepted everywhere, it's as if he's a thief. So again, we see very much a direct connection between kingship and the currency that they have.
It's almost a democracy.
Yeah, in some ways. In other ways, you don't necessarily have a choice but to accept their currency. But yeah, and then do you want to scroll down to the next page? Okay, and then the last piece is actually a rabbinic term. The last piece that just kind of again highlights coins and kingdom is there's a term called asimon, which is the Lashon Chazal for a matbe'a shelo hutbe'o alau simanim. So basically an asimon is a coin without any signs or symbols on it, right? It's actually a Greek word that says asimon. So the a in front is like without, like a negation of it, so it doesn't have a siman. And that type of coin is actually, it's not valid currency. It's not accepted anywhere. So we now start to see that coins relate to the kingdom, but not only that, there's actually a term that directly calls it a sign or a signifier for the kingdom. So I think with that in mind, we can now begin to understand the etymology of teva better. Just as the coin is a symbol of the king and represents his power, so too nature symbolizes the supreme king of kings and his power. Right? So nature is just a signifier for the signified that is God. And we'll see this throughout a few different rabbinic and texts. So the first one is the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, and it says, להגיד גדולתו של מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא שאדם תובע 100 מטבעות בחותם אחד, וכולם דומים זה לזה. מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא תובע את האדם בחותמו של אדם הראשון, ואין אחד מהם דומה לחברו. לפי כך, לכל אחד ואחד לומר, בשבילי נברא העולם. Right, we see already in the Mishnah that they have this idea that God is essentially minting all the humans, that we are God's coins. In that sense, right? And this is kind of similar earlier to what I said, that the world is God's book. right? There's definitely this idea that you're able to analyze everything through this perspective of a signifier-signified relationship. Again, Rabbi Eliyahu ben Amozer, in Emel HaMikra, he points out that coinage and stamping is a basic Jewish metaphor.
You want to translate the Mishnah for people who
Oh,
watch it?
yeah, yep, sorry about that. It says, to say the greatness of God, the Supreme King of Kings. Say if a man prints or mints coins with just one stamp or one seal, all of them look alike. However, God, he essentially stamped or sealed to mint man, Adam, with just one seal. However, now all of the humans look different. And so it is that for each person, Bishvili Nivra Olam, the world was created for me because we're all different, we're all unique, we're all individual. But to convey that, the Mishnah uses the language of minting coins, which at first glance seems to kind of almost, like, oh, they just did it for an analogy purpose. But in reality, there's a much more significant reason why they chose the analogy of coins that we can now appreciate. Cool, Rahel? Okay. Rabbi Eliyahu ben Amozeg, he comments, he says, this idea, I wasn't able to find the Hebrew exactly to type it up. So he says, this idea is that all creatures were stamped by the signet of God, just as monarchs engrave their images on pieces of silver or gold. Therefore, it is suitable and proper that when our sages spoke about the perception of the essence of beings, they use metaphors connected with currency and banking. Right? So he drives this point home, very clearly. He says, when he's talking about how you perceive the world, using currency is a very appropriate way to talk about how we want to perceive and look at what has been created.
Just for people who don't know, Rabbi Eliyahu ben Amozeg was an Italian rabbi in the 1800s. He was a Kabbalist philosopher. He wrote extensively on a whole bunch of topics, and he wrote a Perush to Torah called Em LeMikra, which discusses, these types of things, obviously. He's unfortunately not too well known, but he is a fantastic chacham.
Yeah. Yep, definitely is. And then the last quote that I want to bring from rabbinic writings is Rabbi Yehuda Levi, right? Very famous for the Kuzari, Andalusian Chacham. He also wrote a book of, he wrote a lot of poems, wrote a lot of poems out there. So I'm going to take two different quotes. The first line is from one, and the last line is from a different poem. But here again, you see a very similar idea. He says, "Halecha aidim berurim mal'u kol har v'geva," and then he adds this line. He says, "Ki bechol surot yesurim yesh la'el hotham v'teva." He says that in every creature's shape there is the seal and stamp of God. And then also in another place, he evokes a similar sentiment. He says, "V'me adamecha v'chol demuth teva hothamecha." Right? He says every creature has the sign of your stamp, essentially, in them. And so, yeah, I think all these examples really drive the point home. The last point that I want to make is also something from Philo, where he says, and this is the point of, again, that point of the golden doves and the silver dots, right? So the idea is that what I say, again, I can say something, I can speak to someone, but until that person filters it and understands it, what I've said almost has this kind of, unprocessed status. It's not truly out there because no one else has taken it and acted upon it. And so it's in that kind of in-between stage. So he says, since in truth, speech, when it meets the conceptions and embodies them in words, and names stamps what had before no impression on it, so as to make it a current coin. So he, again, kind of makes this point that like unprocessed speech to processed speech is the same relation from unminted coins to minted coins. And you can say almost that the world before it was created in many ways, or before kind of the people view it, it's an unminted coin. But then the minute it's created, or the minute that the humans process it and view it and perceive it, then it turns into a minted coin, because we start to give it meaning, and we start to understand it, and that's where it truly becomes real, right? Like the idea of, like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound, right? The idea is that, like, if no one is perceiving or trying to understand something, then, like, almost does it exist type of idea. And so I think, with all this, we can now really appreciate, why is it called teva? Because it is representing God's power. But as we saw earlier, right, it's just a signifier for the signified. In other words, if God chooses to reveal himself through nature, it's not that nature is something independent, but rather nature is one of the silver dots that God's golden dove is taking. Right? When you look at nature, you're supposed to see God. You're not supposed to see nature. And so I think, I'll kind of conclude with the idea that this idea that oh, shit. So I'll just conclude with this idea that just trying to find it. Just slow computer. Yeah. So the idea is, right, we're able to see that linguistically, the perception the Jews had isn't that nature is a replacement for God, but rather it's just a signifier for it. And even in our tefillah, if we notice in the Amidah that we say 3 times a day, we say in the same exact paragraph, just a few short sentences away from each other, in order to demonstrate how powerful God is. Right? We say not only is he mehayyeh methim, right? Something that naturally I think we would inherently view as extremely powerful, but we also say is mashiv haruach umorid hageshem, right? Something that right, hamchasesh shamayim be'avim, right? He puts clouds into the sky, as Hamdawi Nieto points out, right? Like, that's God doing it, but that is just as impressive and just as awesome as mehayyeh methim. And the idea is that by choosing to use the word teva for nature, the Hebrew perspective is that is the case, right? They are both just as amazing, and to say otherwise is un-Hebraic. That's kind of it. The rest is some appendix points, more about Ferdinand de Saussure. He's kind of the father of modern linguistics and really kind of developed this signifier, signified. Emile Benveniste is a Syrian, linguistic philosopher. He also kind of does a lot of analysis on the semiotics and semantics. There's also Jacques Derrida, an Algerian, who really took it, kind of like even a step further. And just like for further reading, if anyone wants to. But that's kind of the conclusion of the shiur.
All right. Thank you very much. Sure, we all enjoyed it. I did.
Thank you.
But I don't think that necessarily argues with Leibowitz's perception necessarily.
Yeshayahu?
Yeah.
Well, I think his point, he says, right, God did not reveal himself in nature, because if he had revealed himself through nature, then nature would be godly. But the point is that, and worthy of worship. But the point is that nature is how God reveals himself, but it doesn't mean that nature is worthy of worship, but rather nature is just a form in which God, right, nature is just a signifier, but not necessarily inherent of itself of being the signified.
Right. He doesn't mean that God never minted coins, or he means that, like Harambam says, that that there was the the 6 days of creation, interpreted metaphorically, so the evolution, and then God does not interfere with the workings of, the natural law. So, I mean, that's what he meant to say. I mean, I read his stuff, so I know that that's what he means to say over there.
Okay. This one is perfect.
Sure. All right. Stop recording. Unless there's any more questions. No. All right.
Ellie, you're so quiet.
He says his microphone doesn't work. All right.